Here's a lesser-known Miike film, and unfortunately, it's lesser known with good reasons. As the Gods Will is a Takashi Miike film adapted from a manga. While the director has had great success adapting manga to film, like Ichi the Killer, this is definitely a lower-tier Miike movie, but it's not without its moments. As the Gods Will is yet another teenage death game story. In this, students are forced to participate in a variety of games that usually mimic, like, schoolyard playground games, but with deadly consequences. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's a bunch of high school students killing each other or in this case, getting killed by things, so maybe it's a little different. Being adapted from a manga, Miike does not shoulder all the blame for this movie. Now, I'm going to explain a little bit about my history with the manga. The first thing I saw was a trailer for the film, which looked fantastic. It looked funny, and it looked bloody, so that's all 3 of my check marks right there. On top of that, it's a Miike movie. So with that in mind, I decided to check out the source material while waiting for the movie to be released, and then waiting for it to be subbed. If you've read Gantz and Battle Royale, there won't be anything to surprise you here. It's another teenage death game manga, except this time the reasons for the death game are really vague and weird. Of the 3 aforementioned death games, it's probably the most Japanesey, being that most of the games are pretty entrenched in Japanese iconography. It's a little weird and a little more surreal than Gantz or Battle Royale, which is enough to set it apart, even if it ends up playing out like every other death game. But the real kicker, and what ruins the manga, is the ending, because there is none. Just as the main character finally starts to get development, he is shot out of the plot and left falling to his doom. That ending was brought about by the manga shifting to another magazine. Instead of continuing it, the writer started from scratch with a prequel, sequel, interquel series that runs parallel to the first events of the manga. But I never bothered with the second manga, and to be honest, I'm never going to. The ending of the first left me with such a bad taste in my mouth that I didn't even bother to watch the movie when it got subtitled for the longest time. Flash forward to last week, and I'm bored and I want to see some bloody high schoolers. So I finally decided to check out the Miike movie. And unlike Gantz, I can't say this was an improvement. All the problems of the manga are carried over into this movie. There's no real explanation for the game, and the characters remain pretty shallow right up until their deaths. Now, I should explain, because I praised Gantz for leaving out the explanation, that it's a little different here. Because while you can still argue that As the Gods Will doesn't focus on the explanations, and you don't need that to fully grasp what is essentially just high schoolers dying, it starts to answer the questions, and then immediately stops, and I'll get into that later. But there are positives brought over from the manga as well. There's some pretty faithfully recreated scenes that work just as well as they did in the manga, if not better. The opening scene and the cat game are probably what I'd call the best points of the movie, and they're just ripped straight from the manga. Now, it's fine to have shallow characters and vague explanations if you have something to make up for it. If you have something that can entertain an audience enough, they will forget about obvious plot holes. Unfortunately, As the Gods Will feels tedious. I saw that coming could probably be said before every single game that these characters play. The audience is always 2 steps ahead of the characters, and that's a bad thing. It only makes scenes feel more drawn out when you can almost immediately guess the solution. There's no surprises here. That's why the first 2 games work so well. The first one in particular is just a red light, green light game with a death penalty. And even though you can tell who's going to make it out alive far in advance, the stakes give the scene some more tension. It's also capped off with a fantastic little joke, which shows the direction that this should have gone in. Parody. This applies to the manga as well as the movie. There was already an oversaturation of death games in 2014. With the games being as ridiculous as they are, this could have perfectly lampooned the typical death sport, manga, anime, whatever story. And although they both start out looking like they might do just that, in the end they ultimately take themselves a little too seriously. To top all that off, much like the manga it's based on, the movie ends on a cliffhanger. It's clear that they overestimated the appeal of this manga and were planning on a follow-up film. I think it's safe to say, with Mike moving on to his thousands of other projects, including a JoJo movie series, that we're not going to get this sequel. It's not all bad though. This is far from Mike's worst movie. I've seen much worse from this man. He has a catalog of what feels like thousands of films. It definitely feels more like a contract job than something that Mike actually put real effort into. The man has to direct half of Japan's movie industry each year, so cut him some slack. The film is shot really well. Mike has been in the industry for years, and he knows how to set up an interesting shot. The CG is fine. It looks a little off-putting, but it seems like that was probably the intended effect. I actually really liked how choppily the bear moved. It was an extra detail that gave him a little extra character. Not only that, but the film's lead is Sota Fukushi, and he does a great job with what he's given. Although I might be a little biased, since I and most people in the West would mainly know him as Kisaragi Gentaro da. Ore no yume wa この学校の連中全員と友達になることだ。3、2、1。レバーを入れて。There are some moments where he really starts to ham it up, but it's actually the moments where he's quieter and more remorseful that worked better. In 4's, Fukushi was already upbeat and happy, so it was actually really interesting to see that he has some range as an actor. Of course, this is all interesting on a meta level. If you've never seen Kamen Rider 4's, then his character will just come off as underwhelming as the rest of the cast. And just like in the manga, the second his character starts to get interesting, it ends.